Today we get to take a look at another motherboard, and that motherboard is going to be one motherboard versus another board because this is about Thunderbolt audio. So we're going to read the comment, and again we're going to look at the what, why, and how. Why is this a problem? How do I solve it? And what caused it? How do we fix it? So I'm going to provide 3 different solutions because of what I think is going on, and I think as we read the comment, because remember this is about Thunderbolt audio. The system that has been built for quite some time, well, let's go through the comment and then it'll all come together and make sense. But it's going to take a little time to go through this because, again, remember this is Thunderbolt audio and we have to have some specificity. This ought to be fun. Hope you guys enjoy this as much as we do. And this comment is in response to the video we did about the 16-core CPU comparison, Intel versus AMD, which was talking about an i9-12900K, a 5950X, and a 3955WX Threadripper Pro. Another story, stay tuned for that. The saga continues. So I'm going to scroll down to the comment and zoom in on it. And this is from Gabe T. Hey Gil, I just discovered your channel. I'm very impressed. I have an Aorus Z690 Gaming 7. So the title of this video is going to be Thunderbolt Audio, Gigabyte Aorus Z690 Gaming 7 versus a Gigabyte Aorus Z690 Elite DDR4. And stay with me as this saga continues and unfolds because it gets interesting, and a problem that I think had a simple solution became more complicated because of the process. Again, it's about specificity. Really, I think the name Thunderbolt for audio, Thunderbolt really ought to have in parentheses PITA at the end of it because it can work and it will work and it does work, but getting there, you got to follow all the steps. The question. All right, I'll start over. Hey Gil, I just discovered your channel. I'm very impressed. I have an Aorus Z690 Gaming 7 and I bought the Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 add-in card. I have both the version 1 and version 2.0. And that's important. I'll get to it in a minute. I can't get either of them to work. I updated the BIOS to F15. And third, to update the firmware and hardware. I'm still not working. The card is plugged into the PCI by 4 slot as recommended by Gigabyte. Can you make a video or share some advice on what I should do next? I built this computer back in late 2018. I use it for audio production. I just bought the Presonus Quantum 2626. Congrats. Nice addition. Which is Thunderbolt 3 audio interface. I run Windows 10 64-bit. Smart. Thank you. And first comment. Welcome. My allergies have been giving me fits. Give me a few days to go over your specs. I may have a video response, which we do, which this is what this is about. Appreciate your patience. And then Gabe said, good morning, sir. Just a quick update. I was able to get the card recognized, meaning Thunderbolt, in Device Manager, so the interface was able to be kind of recognized. Kind of is the key operative there. Because we're going to actually solve, or excuse me, I say solve, we're going to actually answer 3 different questions. But for this one question, we're going to have 3 different solutions. So this is number 1. And question number 2 will become apparent as we go through this. Okay. Good morning, sir. Quick update. I was able to get the card recognized in Device Manager, so the interface, Thunderbolt 3, was able to be kind of recognized. That's crucial. I still don't have anything Thunderbolt related in the BIOS, and that's a problem. When I connect my audio interface, the Quantum 2626, I either get a flashing blue light or a steady red light. And that's the problem. I also upgraded to Windows 11. You've just compounded the problem. I upgraded the card firmware from 23 to 50, talking about the Thunderbolt 3 card, and he didn't say specifically which one. All these specificities matter. Please let me know if you need more info. Yeah, a whole bunch more info. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with where I think the problem is at, but before I get into it, anybody have any idea what this may be the solution to? It's going to look pretty simple, but it gets complicated because it's like taking a handful of something and just throwing it out. You've got to take that handful of whatever it is and separate it and organize it and get it 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's what we're getting ready to do. So anybody got any ideas what the problem might be? He's got a Thunderbolt 3 audio interface. Put that aside. We've got a Thunderbolt 3 Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 from Gigabyte, which has the 5-pin Thunderbolt 3 header. We'll get into that. And he's also tried both of the cards, which are the Titan Ridge Revision 1, Revision 2. What's the difference? Well, Revision 1 and Revision 2 have different firmwares and they have different drivers. So if you've got either one of those, the version 1 has a firmware update. I think the version 2 still uses the original, but both version 1 and version 2 have, to reiterate, different driver versions. And all that matters, what driver you're using when you're updating the firmware. And everything matters on all these steps. So we've got to deal with the motherboard first. We've got to get that audio interface working, but we've got to get that Thunderbolt working in that motherboard, which means we need BIOS support. So another question comes up. Do you have to have, because I've read, I'm telling you what other people have asked, that you don't have to have BIOS support? Well, we did a video and we showed where you can get Thunderbolt 3 partial support. Partial means it works sorta, not with everything. Okay, there's Thunderbolt 1, 2, and 3. Thunderbolt 1 and Thunderbolt 2 are called legacy. Thunderbolt 3, which is what we're dealing with, and we're going to get into Thunderbolt 4 in a minute. Thunderbolt 3 is called native support. So when you plug, let's go overhead. I like showing this machine because what's fascinating, this is the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare, specifically the TRX40 chipset, and that is Thunderbolt 3 that we have in this machine. Hold that thought, because this gets interesting. Okay, we have Thunderbolt 3. We've done several videos working in this machine, and Thunderbolt 3 can also work on the WRX80. Separate video, but keep that in mind because I'm going to show you some information where everything's not always apples and apples and everything's not always in one place, and that's what we're trying to do is keep it simple and make it work. Okay, we got a motherboard we got a problem with. We don't have BIOS support. So back to the question of, do you have to have BIOS support? If you don't have BIOS support, you will only have Thunderbolt 3. I have Thunderbolt 3 in here, but because I have BIOS support, I also have legacy support, which means I have Thunderbolt 1 and 2. Now, if I don't have BIOS support, I have tried it in this machine, which is effectively on the Thunderbolt header, on the Thunderbolt card, jumping pins 3 to 5, which effectively keeps the card alive. It has the same effect as if I had that cable plugged into the motherboard on a machine like this that has BIOS support, because I have the cable plugged in. Now, to reiterate, if without the cable plugged in that I have down here, and all I do is jump pins 3 to 5, it has the same effect because the motherboard acts like it's connected and it's in the BIOS. So the only way I can show how that works is on a non-supported machine, which we did on the X399 because it had the Thunderbolt header. What was up with that, Gigabyte? But they never did do BIOS support. So even though we plugged it in, it was effective as in jumping pins 3 to 5. Cables plugged in but no BIOS support, so we had partial support, meaning we had Thunderbolt 3, native support, no Thunderbolt 1, no Thunderbolt 2, which is legacy support. Okay, that's where he's at with this. The delineation, the specificity. He can have Thunderbolt 3 native support, but he cannot set a whole bunch of things like on the X299 with what Asus did, root port selector, and a whole bunch of other stuff for Thunderbolt. Because on your Thunderbolt ports, you've also got a couple of memory apertures that I could set with this. What happens if you can't set those memory apertures? Devices may connect and disconnect, which I think is what's happening with what he's got. Again, no BIOS support because he can't set the memory, which allocates some of the system RAM for those devices. Now, there's a small amount of RAM because of the way that thing boots that's allocated, but not enough RAM for what he wants to do with that interface. So we have got to have BIOS support. So the question, to reiterate, do you have to have BIOS support? It depends. Depends on the device. As far as this audio goes, this is what's happening. Okay, let's keep going because it's a conundrum and it only gets more interesting. So the first thing we're going to do, let's go take a look at the motherboard he's got, which again, to reiterate, is a Gigabyte Aorus Z370 Gaming 7. Now I got to tell you guys, I have about 5 hours into this. So you absolutely doggone right we had to make a video about it because I had to do a lot of what if and thinking, and you'll see what I mean when I get into this. I want to keep this tight, but everything we're going to talk about here is extremely relevant. Okay, here's the motherboard. First thing we need to pay attention to. I'll zoom in up here so you can take a look at. We're looking at a motherboard, and we're looking at revision 1. Based on that part number, Z690 Aorus Gaming 7, there is no revision 1, 2, or 3. Why is that relevant? On some of the motherboards, specifically Gigabyte, where there has been a revision 1, 2, and 3 of a motherboard, revision 1 may not have Thunderbolt support, which means they would not have two things. The Thunderbolt header on the motherboard to connect that little cable to tie those together so that the BIOS says, oh, here you are. Revision 1, to reiterate, wouldn't have it, but revision 2 and the rest of them would have. That distinction is important. We don't have that here. But as we go forward, looking at other motherboards, that has to be determined. So the next thing we need to look at, we got to go to support. I'm going to pull down the manual. We're going to take a look at it. But the first thing I need before I do the manual is I've got to look at downloads. And I really wish he hadn't have done this because he's only made the problem more complicated. We're going to do Windows 10, and I'll explain as we go through this. Windows 10 64-bit, we have drivers 43. And what I want to find out right here as we scroll down, BIOS. Here's the key. That's 16 BIOS updates. So as we look at that, I'll scroll back up and find it. This motherboard started in about 2017 of, let's see, 0907 2017. Okay. Your motherboard, when you acquired it, could have had, you said you built it in 2018. Depending on the age of the motherboard, we could look at the ASIN number on Amazon, but just safe to say, your motherboard could have had F2, F3, F any one of these. Now, here's what's important. You said you've updated the BIOS too, but what you did not specify that I need to know that I'm talking about, that's why I'm doing this in the video, is when you update a BIOS, any motherboard that has anything to do with Thunderbolt, whether it's built onto the motherboard specifically, especially, or if it's a Thunderbolt add-in card like we're dealing with, which we'll deal with on the other motherboard that I'll get into. What we need to know is, did you step through all the BIOS updates from when you received the motherboard to the current one? If you skipped any of them, we have a problem. We have two problems, and I'll show you. First, let me space this on that back out. I'll zoom out. So we go from F2 up to the one that you say you have, which is an F15. Now we have an F15A, we also, which is lowercase, and an F15B lowercase. Those are both beta. And there may be an F15 something else. Yeah, F15. The only two you could have skipped would have been the beta BIOSes. F15A or F15B, lowercase. Let's go back. If you'll notice here on the right, even though we do not have an errata document like we had many moons ago, we still get a little bit of information about what's going on with these BIOS updates. And what's important as we look at these, starting back down here from F2, the first release, I'm looking for one specifically that deals with Thunderbolt, and what I need to know is, right there, F11. F11 supports support for the Titan Ridge. That's when that came about. And the date on that looks like that came into bearing in 2018. 11/7/2018. That would have been F11. Now I need to know, and I'm asking a question I'll ask to reiterate again, did you step through all those BIOS updates or did you skip one? Because a BIOS has nooks and crannies. Think of it kind of like the hives that make up Windows, the registry. There's different hives, different information. So if you did not step through each one of those BIOSes, and if you skipped any, you skipped the most important part, which is this, and who knows what else you might have missed. You've always got to step through those BIOSes. Now, to compound the problem, the easy solution would be to just go back and go through those BIOS updates up the tree. And I'm going to show you why we can't. And this kind of sucks. In fact, this kind of sucks big time. Because you're at F15, according to these BIOS updates, this is a new thing that started, which I'm not a fan of because it's supposed to simplify, but how can something that complicates things simplify things. Introduce encapsulated BIOS. So that is going to be a problem because, as it says, customers will not be able to reverse previous BIOS version due to major vulnerability concerns. There's a lot of information out there about what an encapsulated BIOS is. I just want to tell you, you took a simple problem and made it PITA. It's now become a whole lot more complicated. So, question number one, how do we make this work? Answer number one, you need to step through those BIOS updates, which you can't do because you now have F15, you have the encapsulated BIOS, so you can't go back to move forward. Once you've gone there, it's like the rest don't exist. So if you don't have BIOS support on that motherboard is SOL as far as hooking up that Thunderbolt 3 audio interface. Yeah, I know that's the conundrum. So option number two, we need another motherboard. Let's take a look at Thunderbolt 3, and we're going to also take a look at Thunderbolt 4 because we got to explore our options and do the what if. I don't like it, but it is what it is. What I want to do now, I'm going to go to PC Part Picker System Builder. We're going to pick a motherboard based on, you have Gigabyte, and we're looking at the Z370 because I want to show you what I went through as I was looking for options. Okay, Gigabyte Aorus Z370. The problem is we're looking at, if we're looking at, because we can't update the BIOS because of what you're at right now with the BIOS, and you have to have BIOS support, which answers the question, do you need BIOS support? Well, depends. For this situation, absolutely. Okay, so answering this question, as we've answered one solution creates another problem. Looking at that motherboard, the Gaming 7, if you'll notice, over here there's nothing for prices. So if we're looking at motherboard prices, we have 1, 2, and when I was originally doing this research, I had 3. I'm down to 2. I'll tell you right now, these two motherboards that show they're available, one's 330 and one's 430. Either one of these motherboards is a possibility. Both are ATX. Both support 64 gigs. So your first option is the BIOS update we can't do. Your second option is another motherboard of what you've got so you can use everything that you have so that we can get this BIOS support for Thunderbolt 3. So if we take a look at the first motherboard, the least expensive one, it shows it on Amazon. Let's take a look. Now we're looking at an old motherboard, and for the buying options, there's one dealer that's got it. If you're going to have to buy a motherboard, I'm going to do now look for the ASIN number, and this shows me this date of this motherboard was from excuse me, and this shows me the date of this motherboard was from September the 29th of 2017. Now either one of these motherboards that we're looking at right now, based on the date for the chipset for the processor that you have, we're talking about a brand new old motherboard. I wouldn't do it. So your first option is updating the BIOS, which we can't because we have to go down to go back up to be stepping through all those BIOS updates. If you had stepped through them, you would have it. You didn't. So that's what I think is going on. So option number 2 is a motherboard, same chipset. And the issue with the reinstalling Windows, that's a separate issue. We're just trying to get this thing up and running so we can get this Thunderbolt audio interface. And you gotta slow down with all this stuff you're doing. All you're doing is making the problem worse. So what we want to do is, if we're looking at another motherboard, is that a wise option to buy 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, 22? A 5-year-old motherboard? No, I wouldn't do it. Now, because we're looking at a 5-year-old motherboard, let's go take a look at the Thunderbolt add-in card from Gigabyte, see where we're at. I really wish you guys would come to us before instead of after, but it is what it is. So I want to take a look at your processor right quick. You have an i9 9900K, hopefully. You got 8 cores, and you can get to 5 gigahertz. And you've got up to DDR4 2666. And you have also, let's see, the graphics memory can go to 64 gigs on board. what I'm looking for, okay, PCI Express. Your PCI Express configurations. Here's where we're at based on the technology at that time. 1 by 16, 2 by 8, 1 by 8 plus 2 by 4. So based on what comes out of your processor, you have one 16-lane slot, which is for your GPU. And again, a maximum PCI Express lane 16. Newer machine, you'll have 20 lanes to the CPU, but I wanted to double check that. Okay, let's go back over. And that's the motherboards you have, and of course it's not available, but I wanted to show you right quick. Nobody's got it, nobody's gonna have it. It's history. And then we're in the same time frame. So I want to double check on your chipset based on the Z370. Intel Z370 chipset. Okay, the Intel Z370 chipset. I want to see what you got. 2 DIMMs per channel. PCI Express 3.0. PCI Express configurations. We have by 1, by 2, and by 4. You got 24 PCI Express lanes. Okay, supported processor PCI Express configurations. 1 by 16, 2 by 8, 1 by 8, or 2 by 4. Okay, you got 1 by 16, which is what that reinforces. I want to double check what you had on your chipset. Okay, my suggestion is going to be, first let's go to the Titan Ridge. Now, the Titan Ridge, this is revision 1. Titan Ridge, Thunderbolt 3. We're going to also take a look at Maple Ridge. It'll become apparent here in a second. What we're looking at here, and I'm not going to zoom in on that, maybe a little bit, so you can get a better idea. A Z390 chipset, H370, B360, Z370, and while we're at it, I'll note most of these, not all, but most of these, this is Intel we're talking about, or through the chipset, PCH, Platform Controller Hub. But some, as you will see up here at the top, the Z390, some of these have Thunderbolt plumbed, specifically one motherboard, the Z390 Gaming SLI, has Thunderbolt plumbed through the CPU, which is most curious. Otherwise, most of them are PCH, Platform Controller Hub, through the chipset on the before slot. And if you'll notice, most of these motherboards, I'll zoom back out, most of these motherboards are in that status. Now, of the motherboards, all this is about Intel. There's one workstation, C246, another workstation, C2621, and of course the X299, couple of X299s, and then the AMD X570 and the AMD B550. Now, at the moment, we're talking about Thunderbolt 3, Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3, Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3, revision 1. There's no mention of X399. Yeah, and there's no mention of this machine, TRX40, which is sitting right there with a revision 1 card on that document. I just want to point that out. So the next thing we need to do is we're going to take a look at Gigabyte Titan Ridge, revision 2. And again, remember, to reiterate, they use different firmwares and they use different drivers, and those specified drivers are required to get those firmwares updated. And the firmware on revision 1 needs to be done for a lot of reasons. Got a video about that. Okay, here's what we're looking at. Z490, H470, B460, Z390, Z390, H370, B360, Z370, X299, X299, AMD X570, and AMD B550. And again, 2 others I mentioned. X399, not there. Gigabyte never did get the BIOS update, but they had that one motherboard that's got the connector on it. I won't get into the model, because if you've got it, you know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, it doesn't matter. What does matter is this machine, the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare, is not on that list. Now, again, to reiterate, this card in here is revision 1. We have a revision 2. We've gone through all that. I wanted to point that out. As much as is here, there's still not everything there, which I don't understand why. But specifics matter more. So because we're scratching our head and you want to stick with Intel, I get that. And we're trying to make Thunderbolt working, period. I get that. Instead of looking at, say, a Z370 or even a Z490, what I'm going to do now, Let's take a look and see what's required to get Maple Ridge, which is, now we're looking at the Gigabyte Maple Ridge Revision 1, and this is Thunderbolt 4. So let's see what's required to get that working, because it's all about Thunderbolt audio. So we're looking at the Z690 chipset, and if you'll notice, this also, to reiterate, PCH Platform Controller Hub, PCI Express by 4, that's by 4 slot electrically. So we only need 4 lanes for Thunderbolt, whether it's Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4. And we have a list of motherboards on the Z690 chipset. It also is supported on the Z590, the B560, and it doesn't list any others. So if we go with this list for that card, if I go to PC Part Picker, I have picked out 2 items. I hate to be the bearer of, remember I'm just the messenger, but I hate to be the bearer of this news. But if we cannot get another motherboard with your chipset to keep you with Thunderbolt 3, then what we're going to have to do is get you a motherboard that will support Thunderbolt 4. The problem is you're going to have a computer's 3 items, RAM, motherboard, and processor. To do what we're going to do, we're going to need to get another motherboard. We're going to need to get another processor. Now, based on the CPU you had, I know it's about faster cores, not about core count, because audio is single-threaded. However, if you have to get a new CPU, you might as well get a decent CPU. You might as well get a new CPU, and that's what I'm showing. That's what I'll have the link up, because that's what I'm going to recommend. And this is what we're looking at. So I'm looking at a i9 12900, which is a 3.2 gigahertz, and a Gigabyte Z690 Aorus Elite DDR4 specifically. I want to interject on a side note. The more I look at the more I look at anything with PCI Express 5, like DDR5, M.2 NVMe PCI Express 5, or even PCI Express 5 for the GPU, I don't like what I'm seeing. And if it is going to be short-lived, specifically 2 years, because this is first generation stuff coming out with PCI Express 5, and based on the implementation, I would avoid it and I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So I just want to interject that while we're doing this, because we're trying to get you up and running, and I'm bringing you kicking and screaming, because we can't do the BIOS updates stepped through like we need to. We can't find another motherboard with that chipset like you need, and I wouldn't spend that kind of money for it. So I'm suggesting jump. You built what I would call about a 2-year computer. You got 5 years out of it, so you got your money's worth. However, right now it's all about Thunderbolt audio, so I'm talking motherboard. You got 4 items to get: RAM, motherboard, and processor. You can try to use the RAM you've got, but you may want to speed it up to like DDR4 3200. But now, instead of talking about Thunderbolt 3, we're talking about Thunderbolt 4. The pinout's different. And just to keep it simple, on Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3, there was a 5-pin header. On Gigabyte Maple Ridge Thunderbolt 4, there's a 5-pin and there's an additional 3-pin header. So because of that change in that header, and because you've got to have BIOS support, I'm saying a new motherboard. But if you're going to buy a new motherboard, get a brand new motherboard and not a old motherboard. That's where we're at. So this is kind of option 3, kind of, sort of. I mean, there's no kind of about it. It is. Kind of like saying, is she pregnant? Sort of. No, either she is or she ain't. So anyway, new motherboard, new processor, probably new RAM, and it also means you're going to have to get your hands now also on the Gigabyte Maple Ridge Thunderbolt 4 add-in card. It is what it is. Now, I have looked at the manual for the motherboard you have, but since we can't do anything about the BIOS, there's no point in looking in that manual because of what I know about the BIOS. So now let's go take a look at this Z690 Aorus Elite DDR4 that I'm recommending. We'll go to support. And before I look at the manual, the first thing I want to do is I want to take a look at what we have for BIOS updates, of which there are 4. So that if you're going to do this, and I don't see anything about an encapsulation or an encapsulated BIOS on this version. But if you buy this motherboard, or any motherboard, take note of the BIOS updates and step through each one of them. F3, F5, F6, and even the F7B, which is a beta. That's the one you could skip, but that's too support the i9 12900KS processor. And the processor we have on the list is a 12900K, with this one being KS. So you should be good to go all the way through F6. And based on the BIOS dates, if you'll notice here, improved performance, fixed system reset with a Thunderbolt issue. Thunderbolt, PITA, a work in progress. Improved DDR4 compatibility with the memory. So you don't have to go back to F3. In other words, remember, when you buy a motherboard, whatever BIOS version is there, it'll be on the box, and it'll also say it when you boot the system up. Start at that version going forward. You don't have to go back to the original BIOS, because that would have already been done, whatever the original was. They've done that. They did that at the factory. There ought to be a note up there that says step through all these BIOS updates, but they don't. That's what I'm telling you. So on this one, do that. Don't make that mistake again. I'm sorry it is what it is, but if we can't update the BIOS that you've got to get you Thunderbolt BIOS support, then we have to have another motherboard. If we can't get a motherboard with the chipsets you have, then we're looking at a new motherboard, not a new old motherboard, but a new motherboard. Now, RAM, motherboard, processor, and a new Thunderbolt card, because now you're going, and you'll still have Thunderbolt 3 support, but that motherboard for Thunderbolt support is Thunderbolt 4 support because of the 5-pin and the 3-pin header. So 3 options. Another question that's been asked that I've got to address, some people have said, okay, I've got an Apple whatever, like an Apple display. What does it take to make it work? Well, I'd hate to, again, be the messenger, but I got to show you if what you want for the question you're asking about an Apple display does not work with Intel. There was a time in the beginning it did, but you can take it up with Intel, but I'm going to show you a link for a site you need to look at. Proof's in the doing. This is all about products with Thunderbolt technology. Category any, company any, operating system, we're looking at Windows, and version any, meaning Thunderbolt 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the first thing I'm going to do, based on Windows, is I'm going to look for the category of display. And the first thing I'm going to see is a whole bunch of displays from a whole lot of companies. Now, to show you that this works, I'm going to single this out to one display brand, and I'm going to take a look at Apple. I'm going to hit apply. And if you'll notice, nothing appears, no results. That means, yeah, handwriting on the wall. Whatever Apple display you've got, if it's not in this list, it ain't going to work. It ain't going to happen. There again, to reiterate, some that worked in the beginning. But once all these firmware updates are done to make everything work, because of the specificity, for whatever reason, Intel says it ain't going to work, it ain't going to happen, they're not going to allow it. So you can take it up with them. But if it's on this list, it'll work. If it's not, it won't. That's the easy answer, and that's the solution. So the what, why, and how, 3 different questions. The most complicated, which is what this video is about. I'm just the messenger. So I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. This is BuildOrBuy. Welcome. My name's Gil Boyd, and we'll look forward to seeing you next video. We're out.